Hello, welcome to the latest in this series of Anthropology Communicates seminars hosted by the RAI and organised by the RAI. The Policy and Practice Committee was established as a platform to improve links between anthropologists, policymakers and practitioners. Members of the committee straddle academia, but also applied work, if you like. Some work in universities, others in the health sector, in development and humanitarian aid, in the civil service, in the corporate sector, also for civil society organisations. What unites us all is being anthropologists or being passionate about anthropology's potential to contribute understandings and to improve the world that we all share. Which brings us to these Anthropology Communicates seminars, which we see as an opportunity to spread understandings of anthropology, to highlight anthropology's unique perspectives, and thereby to increase the potential influence of the discipline. It's also an opportunity to encourage anthropologists to engage with different audiences and in different settings and contexts, and by doing so, to bring about positive social impact. In short, these seminars are about highlighting how, what, where, when, and with whom anthropology communicates. So for the fourth in this series, which is titled Anthropology Communicates for Social Justice, I'm delighted to be able to introduce someone who exemplifies the possibilities of translating research, but also personal experience into campaigns for progressive policy change. Dr. Suriyah Bi. Suriyah, welcome to the RAI, and also welcome to the Anthropology Policy and Practice Committee, which you've just recently joined. So this is a chance to meet other members of that and to introduce you to the community. Suriyah studied at Oxford, went on to do an MA at SOAS University of London and a PhD at UCL. She now lectures at the Department of Anthropology at Edinburgh University. And while doing all that, is also the founder and CEO of the Equality Act Review. And I think there'll be a link coming up in the chat, which takes you to their website. The Equality Act Review is an organisation that campaigns for the strengthening of the Equality Act of 2010. Suriyah has worked closely with MPs to promote social justice, and we're honoured to have with us here today Mr. Afzal Khan, the MP for Manchester Gorton since 2017, and the Shadow Deputy Leader of the House, and Mr. Tanmanjeet Singh Dhesi, who represents Slough as an MP and is the Shadow Minister for Railways. I know that there's a lot of demands, multiple demands on MPs and their time, so I'm really happy that we have Tan and Afzal here with us today. But I also realise that you may be called away at the last minute, and we're prepared for that. We will be very flexible. Let's see how this goes. But thanks for joining us. I'm now going to hand over to Suriyah, who will talk first, followed by Afzal and then Tan. The plan is that they will talk for about 40 or 50 minutes together, and then we'll open up for a conversation. So questions, but also contributions from the audience. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Suriyah.
Hi, thank you, Richard. It's such an honour to be here today. Thank you for everyone for joining us, and thank you to Emma as well, who chairs the RAI Policy and Practice Committee. I'm really pleased and excited to be joining the committee at the RAI at this moment in time. And I really look forward to contributing further and working together in this global community of anthropologists and policymakers to really make a positive social impact in the world today. I'm just going to start by sharing my slides today and then make a start. Can everyone see my slides? Yeah, okay, brilliant. Okay, so as Richard said, today's seminar that I'll be presenting on is titled Anthropology Communicates for Social Justice, Strengthening the Equality Act. The aims and objectives that we'll kind of be looking through this seminar and through the slides today, I'll be talking about my positionality as a Muslim woman, as a woman from the margins, and employing positionality and reflexive anthropology in something that I refer to as academic activism. And what does that look like? and really breaking down the mechanics of academic activism today for social justice. We'll turn to ethnography-based policy and what ethical anthropology might look like. And one of the mechanics of academic activism that I employ is the theory of the cycle of decolonization, which I'll be demonstrating. Then I'll be talking about liaising with MPs and policymakers and what that might look like, because we often have great works that we published and we put, you know, so much energy into them and so much of our time, love and passion into them. But often MPs, you know, very struck for time, may not be able to engage with the text as a whole. So how do we repackage those texts to really cater for MPs and policymakers so that they can push for policy change? And how employing the media also is a really helpful tool. And then we'll be turning to hearing directly from Afzal Khan and Dhesi, both MPs. So to begin with, mentioning positionality, as I mentioned, I believe I see myself as a woman from the margins, born and brought up in one of the poorest constituencies in the UK, Hodge Hill, Birmingham, particular ward called Alum Rock, high ethnic minority community, lots of poverty, disadvantage, high unemployment rates, and one of the communities at the moment who's been really badly hit by coronavirus, especially the disproportionate impact on ethnic minorities that we're coming to see in the UK, that coronavirus has impacted. My identity as an ethnic minority of Kashmiri heritage, who's a Muslim woman, a visibly Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, has at times, you know, I've encountered first-hand experiences of religious discrimination, which exposed me to the legal system when I was dismissed from one of my employments that I had about 6 years ago now. While I was a PhD student and funding myself through employment, I was dismissed on the grounds that I was uncomfortable with the curriculum in the eyes of the school at the time. And I write about this in the Journal of Muslims in Europe, More Than Multiple Jeopardy, Navigating the Legal System, as a British Muslim woman litigant in person without any recourse to legal aid or legal support. And I won my case in 2017, but it took quite a long time, and it's currently in the appeals tribunals because I did not win on the religious discrimination claims. And I stated that the way that the Equality Act in this country is currently composed does not consider the context. So the judge actually thought that I would Christian or a Jewish woman would have been treated in the same way as I would have been treated. But my points were that there had to be the context of a 9/11 equivalent and a visible kind of marker of identity for the Christian or Jewish woman to have experienced something that the same thing that I'd gone through. And really, it was through this exposure to the legal system as a litigant in person, fighting for my own rights, that I was exposed to the flaws of the Equality Act 2010 legislation. And I realized that the Equality Act actually protects characteristics and protects people in the UK based on their biological characteristics mainly. And it's really the social, cultural aspects of human life that anthropologists we often look at is not really incorporated in the Equality Act. So that was then inspired to found the Equality Act Review in 2018. Which I did with this view to strengthen the Equality Act. So some of our aims and objectives were to make the list of protected characteristics more inclusive. For example, homelessness is not currently protected by the Equality Act, and homeless people actually, the homeless community gets a lot of discrimination, especially in employment, and that's currently not a protected characteristic. Poverty is another one that is leading to a lot of discrimination, but is not currently protected in the Act or under the Act. So again, it's kind of the protected characteristics that are within the remit of the Equality Act as of now are great, and it is a landmark Equality Act legislation, but it can be improved, and that's what we really do as an organisation. So when I was first founding the Equality Act Review, very nervous, didn't know, whether people are going to come on board or not, but I had quite a lot of networks, and that's something that I tapped into. So I'd worked in Parliament part-time while I was studying for my PhD, and I came across and built relationships of trust with a number of MPs that I'd worked closely with, and so they were more than willing to kind of support the Equality Act Review, and we'll be hearing from Afzal and Tan later, both of whom have been championing the Equality Act Review since then. And so this was 2 pictures from our launch event in 2018 at the Houses of Parliament, where we had some an audience attendees and panel speakers as well. It seems a lifetime ago now, given the social distancing that we're also used to in this day and age. And so part of setting the Equality Act Review up, what I did was reach out to the MPs that I had worked with and ask them for quotes to say, well, okay, this is why we support the Equality Act Review, this is why we feel this is an important cause, and get them to commit to supporting the Equality Act Review, and have these quotes put up on our website to develop this kind of snowballing kind of technique and credibility for the organisation. And what I realised was if one MP was on board, then other MPs were saying, okay, well, this seems like trustworthy, this seems credible, I'm happy to also put my name towards this. And I think that's really important. The economy of trust, that's something that we look at as anthropologists in many different ways and through our works, is really important in kind of engaging with policymakers as well. Then I want to turn to ethnography-based policy, which is a really key kind of turning point for the organisation. It's great to have MPs and policymakers support us, but it's about the work we do, and it's the quality of the work that we do that's really important. That speaks volumes, and it really helps snowball the impact, but also the support that the organisation receives, and the work that as an anthropologist that I can then do in reaching out and amplifying the social impact that can occur. And the glue to this, the kind of the key ingredient, if you like, is and always has been ethnography and anthropology, and that's something that I really want to draw out. And I might sound like a bit of a broken record in this short kind of presentation, but ethnography and anthropology is so important in engaging with policymakers. And it's my own experience of often falling on the margins and being marginalized, discriminated against, and finding that my voice was really falling outside of discourse of what people were looking at, or how policymakers were deciding things that directly concerned myself, my community, where I was born and raised. And that really led me to say, okay, well, and commit to bringing ethnography, the narratives that we gain through ethnography, and centering them, at the heart of any reports that I do, that I write up, any policy briefings. It's really those narratives, people who are on the margins, bringing them in and recentering, what's often on the margins. And that's a lot about how I practice ethnography and how I practice policy and practice in this way and through the organisation. One of the examples of this is the report that I conducted, the research on Muslim women's experiences of work and career development, which I did from about 2018, and we launched it last year in Parliament, and Afzal Khan, who's with us today, chaired the event in February last year. And we had Muslim women from all backgrounds, men as well, come along and support this important cause. And it was a really well turned out event. And it's so important to have presence in such an important space. And I have to give credit to Afzal actually, because it was this idea to have a photo taken in this way that really captures the power of the presence that was in that room that day. And I can give credit to the way that ethnography has made this possible. It's getting the stories and narratives that anthropologists that we're so used to, and that comes so easy to us, that you know, allowing us to build a community and to access communities, to then bringing those communities with us into spaces where those communities would not usually have that access, and that's in spaces such as Parliament. And so this is a committee room picture that this picture was taken last year. Some of the findings of the report include there were high levels of resilience amongst Muslim women. So 42% received free school meals. Nearly half came from households below the average household income, but also nearly half had undergraduate degrees, and about 85% were actively engaged in the labour market. We also saw a loss of aspiration and talent. So using the idea of reverse engineering, which is another theory that I kind of use and look at as social phenomenon and think about, well, how did that come about? And then reverse engineering it to think, okay, well, it started at school or college, and then make policy recommendations to intervene at those particular spaces and points in time to ensure that the end outcome that we often are left with as anthropologists, we're intervening and we're changing the social aspects of those phenomenon that come to us. And often policymakers as well. So the example of this is the loss of aspiration and talent between the ages of 14 and 22. So out of 425 women, 79 wanted to be doctors at the age of 14, but only one became a doctor out at 22 from the entire 425 survey respondents that we had. And so the recommendations that we made were that at the age of 14, we must have policy recommendations targeting 14 to 22, because that's when the loss of aspirations occur. But if it hadn't been for the reverse engineering methodology, we wouldn't have had this transformational kind of insight into where along the process things were going a bit wrong. And then we also found high levels of Islamophobia, with nearly 50% experiencing Islamophobia and discrimination in the workplace. But again, bringing it onto narratives, because I love narratives and ethnography, as I'm sure you probably know by now. I want to share some of the narratives that we collected through the research. So I was dismissed, sacked for refusing to remove my headscarf. Staff members have a problem with my hijab, and they cloak this as an infection control issue. A staff member told me she wanted to burn my scarf when I was changing, so I would have no choice but to come outside the changing room without one. People assume that since I wear the hijab, my English skills will be poor. After putting on a hijab at 26, I noticed major differences in the way I was treated, both in current existing workplaces and future job applications. I was treated as a representative of my race and faith every time there was a grooming case or a terrorist attack. Patients asked not to be treated by a Muslim doctor. So it's really through these narratives. I mean, we have statistics all the time, but it's through these narratives that really appeal to the heart and the soul. And this is what this ethnography is really can be a tool for policy making. And it's these things that policymakers can really look at. It's this thick description that Geets refers to, that can move policymakers and get them to think, okay, well, that's really horrible in the workplace. I wouldn't want anyone to go through that. What can we do as policymakers to ensure that workplaces are more inclusive? And that's what the report did. And that's how we had so many people turn up in that room. That's how we have had so many MPs really pay attention and think about the way in which these issues in the workplace were affecting Muslim women, and what kind of action can be taken as a result. This brings me on to the cycle of decolonization, a theory which I have to say, still developing and writing about. Hopefully I'll publish it later this year in a journal. But I want to really demonstrate and underscore that this is so important to the work that I do, and it underscores the work through the Equality Act review as well. And often decolonization is quite static, I feel, and obviously, you know, as academics, I respect different opinions, but from the way I've engaged with and encountered decolonization, it's been quite static within academia. And what I feel that we need to do as academics, particularly, and for decolonization as a concept, is to engage it from the community, academia, and policy and politics and policy making. And it will really help us think of decolonization beyond the curriculum. And demonstrating this with an example is a report, Empowered Employment. So we saw this from the community level, women's experiences in employment, that was put in a report. Then we relayed this to policymakers with a launch, with a report, with policy briefings, with media dissemination. And thereafter, we put it back into the community, or we filtered the findings back into the community through skills workshops that were conducted that were run for free at SOAS last year. And there were 12-week skills workshops for Muslim women, where we every week we focused on a different topic. So this is a poster that exemplifies the Navigating Politics and as a Muslim Woman workshop, which was a 7th workshop in the series. And we had a number of women in policymaking who attended and gave advice to Muslim women. So it's about, well, how we can get the findings into policy, but then the dialogue there just doesn't end. It has to be a cyclical kind of formation, and that it goes back into the community through, for example, in this situation, it was, in this example, it was through the skills workshops. And so really it's through this cycle that we can really decolonize practices, decolonize phenomenon that's occurring, and encourage social justice. And this format, this idea of decolonization in a circular way, allows for social justice to occur. We also use this model for a Predicting Futures report and research project that we conducted in 2020, part 1 and part 2, which was looking at the experiences of students who were impacted by the government's decision to have their grades predicted instead of sitting their exams, because exams were cancelled due to coronavirus. So our first report was Predicting Futures, examining students' concerns amidst coronavirus exam cancellations, which Afzal Khan provided a forward for, and really championed this research project. And we found that through this research, we found the only form of bias was not related to BAME bias. So Black and ethnic minority bias was causing about 30% of bias in the classroom, but we're really exposed to the other biases that were occurring in the classroom. And it wasn't until we heard directly from the students being impacted that we were able to learn about the multiple forms of bias in the classroom, and we were then able to take this to government, to the Department for Education. Even though the Department of Education's response has not been as welcoming and forthcoming as possible, the research, however, has made a difference, especially in kind of collecting these narratives of students who have felt quite isolated and forgotten in this whole process. And our second report, Predicting Futures, which was 2.0, which was published in December, found that 85% of 2091 respondents missed, 65% of 2091 respondents missed out on their university offers as a result of their grades being predicted. And 80% of the entire cohort who took part in this research were from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. We've been able to relay this research and some of the findings of this report to the Department of Education, but also Emma Hardy, MP, who's a shadow minister for universities and further education, who's now calling on the university grade predictions and offering of spaces on courses for the 2021 admission cycle to be much more streamlined. So that's the kind of the circular kind of impact from the community capturing those experiences from the students, relaying them to Parliament, and then a systems change that we've seen in the UCAS systems and the way they'll be managing the admissions in August and September 2021. And also, again, this comes from, the Grade Predictions campaign and research also comes from a positionality, my positionality as a Muslim woman from the margins, as I mentioned before, where if my grades were predicted 10 years ago, pre-pandemic conditions, I was told I'd never get into university, and I kind of made it to Oxford, and then I spent the last year of my PhD studying under Professor Marsha Inhorn, who's also joined us today, at Yale, and that would never have been possible if my grades were predicted. And again, it's this kind of coming from a community, coming from the margins, coming from the community that I do, the background that I do, really inspires me to kind of practice reflexive anthropology and give back to the community that I come from, but not only my community, but other communities and others who may have had similar experiences. And it's really through that lens that my anthropology kind of extends and is practiced. I also want to briefly mention domestic violence against migrant husbands, migrant men. I explored the experiences of migrant men for my PhD research and masculinity in and through marriage and migration. But MPs, as I mentioned before, are struck for time, so they're not going to be able to read a big kind of PhD that I wrote, and many of us have written. Mine was more than 116,000 words, which I'd love for people to read, but MPs just, don't have the time to do that. So it's really about thinking about how do we extract the very relevant information and put that into a one page. And this was a challenge for me, I have to say, to get 116,000 words, put it into a one page policy briefing. And then Weera Hobhouse, MP for Bath, she's a Liberal Democrat, she employed my PhD research in the second reading of the Domestic Abuse Bill, which she gave the speech for in May 2020. And so really, I would encourage anthropologists to really think about which findings you want to relay to MPs and how you want to do that, what's the best way to do that. And so here I did it in a policy briefing or one page, but you can also email as well, and I can discuss this more in the Q&A as well, but this is just for kind of exemplary purposes. It's also really important to employ the media to disseminate the research, and I think as anthropologists, again, a lot of our work kind of goes towards the direction of journals and monographs, which is great. And a lot of the academy kind of functions in that way. It operates on our ability to publish. However, as an when we look at decolonization, the cycle of decolonization, we must also consider the way that we disseminate our research. And a lot of the public, very rarely or may not even have access to the books and the, journal articles that we publish behind paywalls. So how do we want people and communities to access our research? And the media is a really great tool to disseminate research. And these are some examples of media engagement in the last 6 months, from Sky News to Channel 4 to ITV, but also by publishing and writing op-eds and communicating with MPs, so briefing MPs either through roundtable discussions or one-on-one briefings. So here, briefing Emma Hardy, Dawn Butler, Stephen Timms, and the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, as well. So this is really important to kind of engage with and think of the various different ways in which we can disseminate our research as anthropologists, which is incredibly important if we really want to A, decolonize, B, ensure that we're kind of practicing an ethical kind of anthropology where we're giving back, promoting social justice. And so some just kind of final points here. The paper that I'm going to be consolidating a lot of what I've talked about today and a bit more in a paper titled The Mechanics of Academic Activism, Research for Social Justice and Equality at Review, an Anthropology of Policy and Practice case study, which is forthcoming, and highlighting that there's a power that anthropologists have, and a power that comes with anthropological tools and techniques, which, you know, I think as anthropologists we should employ in social justice, and that we should consider ethnography, especially narratives, as a political tool, and as anthropologists, as a community of anthropologists, and at the RAI as well, we need to, I think about the remit of ethical anthropology. What does that consist of? How do we practice that? And finally, for decolonization, in my opinion, to occur, it must be dialectic and cyclical. And so now we'll hear from Afzal and Tan. So thank you so much for joining today, listening to my presentation, and I, warmly welcome Afzal Khan MP for Gorton and Shadow Minister, Shadow Deputy Leader of the House of Commons.
Thank you very much, Suriyah, for that. I'm absolutely honored to be here today at this prestigious Royal Anthropologists Institute with, of course, my good friend Dr. Suriyah and also good friend Dhesi, both of whom I actually work very closely. Anthropology has always fascinated me. The precision closeness with which anthropologists can access communities and societies is quite unique to the discipline and really must be celebrated. It is these narratives we desperately need communicated to us as policymakers so that we can push for change at the government level. In my remit as the MP for Manchester Gorton, I have previously been Shadow Minister for Immigration and Shadow Foreign Office Minister. I'm currently, you heard in the introduction, Shadow Deputy Leader of the House of Commons. And of course, I also serve on many APPGs, including Uyghurs, Kashmir, British Muslims, just to name a few. In all of these roles, I have stood up for the equality and human rights of some of the most oppressed people on this planet, often informed by the journalistic achievements of our brave colleagues working in media and research, conducted by think tanks and charities. However, something that has been sorely lacking is the work of anthropologists who have in many instances studied and engaged with these communities and peoples very closely. The Institute promotes public understanding of anthropology as well as the contribution anthropology can make to public affairs and social issues. It is fitting, therefore, that today I discuss the collaborative work that I have done with Dr. Suriyah and the Equality Act Review. To begin with, the Equality Act Review campaign aims to review and update the 2010 Equality Act to ensure that it meets the changes we see in society today. This work has never been more important than during the pandemic, which has laid bare societal inequalities. And today, I will look at the two pieces of important work with the Equality Act Review, which illustrates inequalities both in education and in employment. Suriyah has touched in some of these, but I will probably give you more from an MP's perspective. So predicting future, as one of the founding members of anti-racism organizations such as Hope Not Hate, United Against Fascism, I know the first-hand serious repercussion of bias and discrimination in young people's lives. The bias that exists in the classroom is most worrying. These are the years when young people shape their aspirations and teachers play a significant role in supporting young people to achieve their best potentials. You know, Suriyah has already touched on how it had an impact on her. If I shared with you mine, it was worse than Suriyah's. Because I did not feel I was getting any encouragement. And at the end, I actually ended up in a position where I thought it was a waste of time in sitting exams. So nowadays, I usually make that into a joke and say that I left school with 9 no levels. I didn't sit any exams, so I didn't pass anything. It's only later that I was able to go back into education. So this actually does have a huge impact on young people and how they are encouraged. So when we see that last year, the government failed millions of students by their incompetence and lack of action ahead of the GCSE and A-level examinations. Exams were not set as a result of COVID-19, and the decision was made instead to predict grades. Together with the Equality Act Review, we foresaw that inherent problems of predicting grades and how this would only risk worsening the educational attainment gap. Evidence shows that there are stereotypes around particular types of students, and as a result, their predicted grades are lower. The results from our report reinforce these concerns, with students from all socioeconomic backgrounds expressing fears over predicted grades, and the key findings highlighted the serious issue of bias. And this bias extended beyond just the BAME, the Black, Asian, minority communities. The identity of students, but also includes other types of bias, such as Islamophobia, favoritism, bad behavior, and social class. It's shocking, 77.2% felt their results were an underestimate of their ability, and 76.7% felt that their grades were lower than what teachers had predicted, with 64.6% missing out on their university offers. So the huge impact you see not only on the students, but it also caused difficulties for the universities too, as the impact of these results a devastating effect on many of the students and their mental health and motivation among respondents. And this loss of aspiration and talent, of course, is deeply worrying. The work helped capture students' frustration and help identify the impact of grade predictions. It confirmed the long-held beliefs that BME students are most disadvantaged in grade predictions and found bias extended in this. As a parliamentarian, this was hugely helpful, not only to identify students' concerns, many of which are my constituents, of course, but it also provides a tangible evidence which can be used to challenge the government and the lawmakers to take action. Now, the second one is, of course, the empowerment and employment unlocking the workplace of Muslim women. You've seen and heard Suriyah on this as well, including that lovely photograph of a huge committee room packed with a Muslim woman in the parliament. It was really, for me, it was motivational seeing that they were able to come to the heart of the power of the government and actually put their case there as well. And of course, as the vice chair of the APPG on British Muslims, Muslim women, and also British Muslims, this is a topic that is close to my heart. And of course, saddens me deeply that Muslim women face these challenges in the workplace and suffer a triple penalty when it comes to career opportunities: race, faith, and gender. Given the current context of hate, discrimination, and Islamophobia, this research has been vital. The report shows that almost half of all women, 47.2%, had encountered Islamophobia and discrimination as a significant challenge in the workplace. While statistics are powerful, they cannot always provide the detail as to what is actually happening, especially at the human level of the embodied experiences. For example, in the Empowered Employment Report, Muslim women told as of how their colleagues said that they would burn their headscarves so they would not have to wear headscarf in the workplace. My own wife, actually, when she was in the early part of her career, she's a dentist. In the interview, they specifically asked her, will you be wearing this headscarf? And so the pressure as a young Muslim woman then you feel is huge, I think. And of course, one can read various statistics all day about Islamophobia, but it is this lived experience that drives us to want to ensure that equality in workplace is practiced. Now, as the former Shadow Immigration Minister, I know all too well the damaging consequences of hostile environment. The dangers of Islamophobia have been seen in the recent events, not only in the UK, but across the world. We have seen during this pandemic the spike of Islamophobic hate crimes, both online and offline. COVID-19 has laid bare inequalities in society, and as an MP, I know firsthand how much constituents have struggled with employment uncertainties. It is simply unfair that one's faith, race, or gender should dictate their career opportunities. There should be no place for discrimination. I held a parliamentary launch event for this important report, and just a few weeks ago, I held another webinar looking at this report, its significance, still relevant a year later from its publication. By inviting and engaging the parliamentarians, we were able to influence decision makers. I was delighted that Caroline Noakes, a Conservative MP and chair of the APPG on Muslim Women, was one of the speakers and genuinely took on board what was being discussed. Her role as the chair of the Women and Equalities Committee is hugely crucial in the work we are trying to achieve here. So in conclusion, let me say this, that this pandemic has shown the gravity of existing inequalities ranging from health, mortality, institutional racism, and education. The role of anthropology in helping inform public policy, therefore, will be key and help decision makers, parliamentarians, and lawmakers better understand the reasons behind these inequalities. Experts have long noted that the BME students are more disadvantaged in grade predictions. And we know that Muslim women struggle with racism and discrimination in the workplace and elsewhere. But these reports have helped confirm these claims and provide a substantial evidence which is useful in challenging the systems which perpetuate inequalities and equip parliamentarians like myself to effectively scrutinize those very systems. It is the anthropological precision and nuisance that allows us to learn about people's experiences in a transformative way. My engagement with Suriyah as an anthropologist has really shown the difference that anthropology as a discipline can make. I want to thank you all attending today and for giving me the opportunity as well to share with you some of my thoughts and the connection that exists in this work that we're discussing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Afzal. Sorry, for a moment there, I forgot I was chairing. I was so busy taking notes. I think we now can invite Tanmanjeet Singh Dhesi onto the stage. Tanmanjeet, can you unmute yourself? Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Richard. May I say, first of all, how impressed I am with your pronunciation of my name. Being an anthropologist, I would have expected nothing less. But no, look, may I say, what an absolute honor and a privilege it is to address the good and the great of the Royal Anthropological Society. Thank you very much, Richard, Haneen, and all of yourselves for this kind invitation and for letting me express my views and to hear indeed the views of yourself. My sincere apologies, as Richard mentioned at the outset, that I will not be able to stay for the entire event. You may, I don't know whether you can see, welcome to my parliamentary office. I've already been in the chamber and I'm expecting to go back in for another debate as well, along with other Zoom meetings that are going on. But I also want to give my immense gratitude to Suriyah and Afzal who were discussing this event and then alerted me to it. So it's great to be here. Well, in terms of anthropology, it's something that is of great interest to me. And I'm somebody being in public life, especially if you're in elected office, if you do not have a knowledge of communities, of societies, of cultures, languages, and so on, you're in the wrong place, because you will not be able to resonate your own message with the public, and vice versa. It's a two-way process, but you've got to really dig deep to understand what's going on beneath the surface of various sub-communities within our overall community. Now, you don't need me to explain to you, but I think it's important that as a parliamentarian that I do thank yourself for your work. Anthropologists have long been associated with an understanding of peoples, communities, and societies. And you have a unique ability, and you're in a position of power when it comes to learning about the complexities of people's experiences, the nuances that anthropologists can capture through participant observation and or interviews can be of great use to policymakers like me. And we can take the narratives and the experiences of people at the very grassroots, as I mentioned earlier, and use this in our policy making. And relying on numbers and statistics, although that is quite powerful in itself, and by the way, I'm speaking as somebody whose MSc was in applied stats, so I know the number power, but that is powerful. But you know, what it does is that alone cannot always provide a holistic picture. And because I think it's the real life experiences that move the heart and soul and the emotion that are central to them, and that those are needed for policymakers to guide policy right now, as I think that was true in the past as well, and no doubt will be true in the future. I mentioned earlier that I have a very, very keen interest in cultures, and I have, thanks to my parents, have been in a position whereby I have been able to be in a position where I look like the majority, but then have been in a position where I have been in a minority. So having been born and brought up in the Slough area, the area that I now have the honour of representing as a Member of Parliament, as somebody who looked very, very different, like Suriyah very eloquently highlighted in her excellent presentation, that can have a very huge impact on how you view others and how you view yourselves within amongst those others. But then for about 4 years, for most of my primary school education, I had the pleasure of going to India, and I studied in the Punjab because my parents wanted me to get the best of both worlds, to have that grasp of language, of culture, especially Punjabi culture and Sikh culture, which I could get by being in amongst many of my relatives who were residing within the Punjab. So that, what I learned from those is that you, in order to dig deep into a culture, you need to be able to try to learn. It's like when somebody takes a gap year, to go to France and to be living in and amongst the French. I think that will do a lot more for you as an individual than anything that, when I learned A-level French within the UK. Now, but the way that you appear to others can have an enormous impact. Just as Suriyah was mentioning with regards to her research, how people wearing a hijab, or whether it's somebody wearing a kippah or a niqab, how they can feel can be hugely impacted by those around them. So I can tell you from my own personal example, when I was studying at school, during my secondary, because for my primary schooling, like I mentioned, I was out in India for most of the time, but I came back to the UK for all of my secondary education. And when I was at school, I was aghast and shocked when one of my so-called classmates tried to pull off my turban. And such a negative experience that can scar people for life. But thankfully, I had the support structure around me, that I had friends and family who supported me through that, and I turned that negative into a positive to make sure that I had that self-confidence. But not everybody can have that self-confidence to go forward in life. So that's why it's important that we support individuals who have been through negative experiences, and that we are aware of those aspects. And I think as anthropologists, no doubt, you will be more aware than most about the importance of such things. And I know that there is a rich body of anthropology of India, given our shared heritage and history, and many anthropologists have undertaken studies exploring farming and agriculture. And I want to talk a bit about farming and agriculture now as well, because we have currently the largest protest going on anywhere in the planet, and I'm alluding to the farmers' protests in India. Now, those farmers, there will be more than 100,000 individuals that have signed an online petition. So we have been discussing that. Indeed, I raised that with the Leader of the House this morning within Parliament. And, so that just shows you how different things can have an impact on, they may be happening in a different part of the world, but they can have an impact on people's lives right here. And that's why it's important that we discuss those things. But we've got to understand the background, the context, the details, and the experiences, the feelings and the emotions of the farmers who are being subjected, as they see it, to dreadful treatment. And it's the voices of the farmers that need to be channeled in and through policy at this delicate time. And when a government or a state either suppresses or oppresses a group of people, anthropologists can be the vessels, the capillaries, the channels of justice, by sharing what interlocutors have voiced and by sharing what you as anthropologists have observed during field work. So the more that that can happen, the more of you that can come forward to talk to parliamentarians about the experiences of farmers, either in India, in the UK or elsewhere, the more we can build up that policy evidence and lobby the government to take this issue up with the UK, for the UK government to take that up with their Indian counterparts. As an MP of Indian heritage, I have spoken up persistently and very boldly at that time, because I do get trolled significantly as well. As any of you that follow my Dhesi Twitter or Facebook or Instagram feeds, you'll see that there's a large number of supporters, but then you also have those Twitter trolls. In India, they'll be referred to as 2 rupees a go, because there just seem to be thousands of people who are paid almost like 2 rupees a go just to constantly put out tweets out there to put a negative perception. But those individuals won't deter the likes of me from speaking up about the issues that we feel are important to our constituents, but also that are true to our values and our conscience. So in conclusion, I would encourage all the anthropologists within the Royal Anthropological Institute to start to recognize the positions of power when it comes to social justice, because as a Labour parliamentarian, equality and social justice is extremely important to me. And as Suriyah mentioned, by engaging in the cycle of decolonisation, we can trigger and make possible a cycle of social justice, which anthropologists are an integral part of. Now, in terms of anthropology, I did say that it was a subject close to my heart, because apart from being a statistician and having studied maths, my MPhil was actually in South Asian history and its connections with Britain. And I looked at how language, religion, politics, and culture can intertwine to an inspiring manner, but also in a very devastating manner, which I looked at colonial and post-colonial history, how it can actually divide people who have shared cultures, shared languages, and that will eventually force them up to putting up borders in between themselves. And we've seen such borders being put up in areas across the world, even in the US, where we had a former president. Thank God it is a former president. I don't know what your political persuasions are on this call, but I know where I stand on that issue, because I think that we should be more inclined to building bridges rather than building walls between people. And that's where your policy evidence as anthropologists is extremely important, because I know that, whether it's been in the Brexit debate here in the UK, whether it's been in other debates across Europe or in Asia, Africa, North America, and so on, there are too many people who are inclined to look at those issues that divide us. But I think it's important to see those issues that unite us as well. So I hope that you will continue on your good work as academics, because the likes of me do value the views of academics and experts. I know there are some who think that academics and experts, or actually I won't say it now because I think it'd be very undiplomatic and unparliamentarian language that some have used, but please carry on your great work, because we're relying on you to provide us with that policy evidence. Thank you once again so much, and it has been an absolute pleasure. And my apologies that I'm going to have to slip out at some point during our ensuing discussion. Thank you very much, Richard and Haneen, and thank you also very much, Suriyah.
Suriyah, Afzal, Tan, thank you ever so much for your comments, and especially for Afzal and Tan. I'll thank you now, because I know you might have to leave. There's a lot we have to discuss or talk about here. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I mean, fascinating. This anthropology communicates for social justice, and the way I think we've moved from the highly local, whether that's a school in East Birmingham or in Manchester, through to issues that affect us globally. We also touched on the Uyghur issue, Kashmir, what's happening in Myanmar at the moment, I think, is another one. So if you would like to ask a question, you can either do so you can raise your hand. So in the reactions section, there's a raise hand button there, and I'll call upon people in the... Then you can put it in the chat section, in the chat function, and if you just put question at the start, and if it's a general question, then that's just leave it at that. If it's a specific question to one or other of the panelists, then similarly, if you could just highlight who that's for. So I invite questions now, and I think I have one from Emma Crew. Would you like to unmute yourself, Emma?
Thank you so much, Richard. Could I begin by welcoming Suriyah to the committee on the Anthropology of Policy and Practice. I mean, we are just so proud to have you as part of our committee. I'm really looking forward to working with you. I thought your presentation was really fascinating, raised so many issues. I'm torn about which one to raise first, but I have one question, I suppose, about your work as both a scholar and a practitioner, and we're interested in communication. So what is the way to communicate as intelligibly and accessibly as possible to as many stakeholders as possible? So I'm interested in this language of decolonizing, which we're very, very committed to in SOAS. But we have a little team, for example, that makes claims about decolonizing because we give grants to Global South scholars. But as my colleagues point out to me, we all have a very different relationship with British colonialism. My ancestors were the colonizers. This is not true for all my colleagues. Some of them, come from former British colonies, their ancestors. So while decolonizing reminds one of the importance of remembering history, is it the best discourse for all, or should we actually focus more on the other forms of language which you also very eloquently used, like hate speech, the racism that people face, navigating politics as a Muslim woman, I thought was a very evocative way of reminding us of lived experience. So I'm torn between thinking the language is good historically, but is it Is it accessible enough? And could I, finally, I won't speak again, but I just thought I'd get all my questions out if that's okay, because it's easier on Zoom. Could I ask Tan and Afzal something about how we could work together? I've never heard MPs talk with such a depth of knowledge about anthropology. Will you be our champions in Parliament, please? And if so, how can we help? How can we collectively explain something about the rigor of anthropology so that it has more credibility? And finally, will you help me persuade the select committees, particularly the International Development Select Committee and the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that they should take more evidence from the Global South when there are topics that affect people in those countries, because they are the real experts. They shouldn't come to me, they should come to my colleagues who are, in my case, in South Asia and Eastern Africa. And now I'll be quiet, sorry to speak so long.
Thanks, Emma. I want to give the opportunity to Tan and Afzal to answer the questions first, in case they have to go. Is that okay? And then I'll take the question. So Tan and Afzal, you can answer the second question first.
Absolutely, you're too kind. I could see him saying, you go first. That's most kind. And thanks, Suriyah, that's very kind of you to go, let us go first, because I've got to leave in about 5 minutes. Emma, absolutely, you can count on me. I can't speak for Afzal, but I'm pretty sure, knowing him and the diverse nature of the work that we're involved in, whether it's with regards to the Uyghurs, Palestine, whether it's things happening in with regards to the Rohingyas and so on, so many things around the world that we are actually involved in, some closer to home within Europe, but some further afield. You can definitely count on our support. Please do email me. All my details are on my Twitter or Facebook or whatever page, or actually the parliamentary address, which is tan.desi.mp@parliament.uk. If you email along to that, on behalf of the society, either that's an email coming in from one of yourselves, then we'll definitely connect you up with regards to the International Development Committee. Sarah is a very good friend, so I'm sure she's another excellent parliamentarian, and she feels passionately about these issues. And if there is that academic rigor and those direct links, no doubt that those select committees will invite those experts. But no, absolutely, you can count on our support and pleasure. Now I think I'll let somebody who's a lot wiser, more older and more experienced than me to take the floor, as I say.
Thank you for that, Tan. You're pretty good, all right? You got lots of experience. I'm going to learn lots from you. I want to know a bit more actually about your journey back to India and back here again. I think that would be fascinating. Yeah, I think, look, there's definitely room for working together. Part of my contribution, Tan's contribution, and of course, Suriyah has given Dr. Suriyah has given lots of examples how we manage to work together. So that option is there. Yeah, Tan and myself are here, but there are lots of other colleagues out there as well who would love to work with you as well. And in a way, I suppose one of the things I would say is the more sort of communication usually you have, and the more better understanding, the stronger the relationship. It goes across the board in life. You know, if you take a step towards someone, they will most likely take a step towards you as well. I think that equally applies with MPs as well. So building that relationship, there's a lot you've got to contribute. I think there's going to be a lot there that actually helps us as we try to demonstrate, Tan and myself today, by working with Dr. Suriyah, how some of that work we were able to take to the heart of the parliament and to the governments and ministers. So again, we then have the opportunity to provide further access, in a sense, either holding a further meetings in the parliament where we can invite other parliamentarians as well. We can do events where we can launch reports, etc., which you may have worked hard on. And that again is, I think, another great way of moving forward. So I don't see why we can't develop this relationship further, and why we cannot have a position relationship that's mutually beneficial. And the other thing I suppose I wanted to take the opportunity some of the work that Suriyah touched on, decolonizing ideas. Now, there are lots of other simple work that can be done. I mean, I've been engaged with Discover-19. It allowed me to reach out to the education establishments within my area, my city. We've got some amazing universities here, some good colleges, and of course, like everywhere else, we have secondary schools, primary schools. And when I sort of reached out, and then I realized that there is actually a work here which needs to be done. Black Lives Matter, the whole stuff, what happened in America and how it became global and how that sort of came to the forefront of the agenda politically as well. That also sort of encouraged us. So over the sort of last 6 months or so, I've been working on this idea of diverse curriculum. Trying to see what that can be done. I mean, at the moment, I'm just working very locally into Manchester, Gorton. But again, you know, as things develop, we've got a number of schools, colleges coming forward, being part of it. A number of trade unions have become part of this as well. A number of community organizations have become part of that as well. And some expert, those in this field have joined in as well. So we ended up with 12, 15 organizations, you know, who are trying to help to shape this and take it forward. So I don't see, you know, how this sort of work cannot be taken forward. I always think, you know, whilst this whole agenda sometimes can be polarizing and people take it from one corner or the other, but at the heart of it, I think when you think about the world we are in and the way we are connected, then in that sense, understanding where we are today is pretty important. The way we connect up, how rich and diverse our great country here, Britain, is now, whatever the history was and how it brought us here today, but we are here today. So it's equally important that we understand the past, how we managed to get from there to here, and what the correct history is, not being looked just with a one sort of glasses at one sort of angle, but in the diverse way, and looking at the reverse side and saying how it had impact, let's say, in an Indian subcontinent point of view. But then I think it also helps us with that better understanding of past and today to project the future better as well. And the work which Tan and myself are passionately involved with is we want to see a better world. We want to see that fairness across the globe, you know. End of the day, there's only one world, one humanity. And the more we understand that, and the better we'll get on. Tan's got to go now. It'll probably be me next.
Love you lot. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you, Tan. Thank you very much.
Cheers. See ya.
If anyone does have further questions, maybe we prioritize Afzal slightly because he may have to go. But we have lots of questions coming in. Just on the point, the answer that you just made so eloquently, and on decolonisation and looking at the past, when you walk into Westminster Hall and the corridor that leads down to the paintings there, can we start by decolonising the art in the Palace of Westminster, please? Okay, so Mark, would you like to unmute yourself? You're next online. Mark Lindley-Highfield.
Hello, good afternoon, and a huge thank you to everybody who's participated in the discussion so far. I'm really pleased to be at an event where such mammoth contributions have been made. I'm here as part of the committee representing the ASA, the Association of Social Anthropologists, and our Apply network, and it's really great to be at such an excellent event, so well organised by the RAI, so thanks ever so much for that. Suriyah, I'm a person born in Birmingham myself and grew up in the not so far away Warsaw, so I'm fully appreciative of the journey you've been on, and you might for that reason appreciate the fact I'm asking a reflexive question, if that's okay, and I'm sure it's probably the case that in terms of other people's experiences, maybe even becoming an MP, that you similarly have these dynamics with relationships. And I was just wondering, you mentioned and really clearly shown us that journey from the margins, as you say, and I'm wondering now in your position as you got to, like as an academic at the University of Edinburgh, how these dynamics have changed for you. I was really interested to read your auto-ethnographic paper that showed along your journey transitions you might expect those processes, educational processes you've been through to make didn't have impacts where you'd maybe expect them to. But I'm just wondering now, as an ethnographer, as a researcher, how you're managing these multiple identities, still as a person on the margins, but also, in some ways people might see, within the establishment, almost by the educational institutions you're associated with, and whether this has transformed for you any of these dynamics. And I think the same thing probably relates to communal relations as becoming an MP as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark, and great to have a fellow Brummie on here. I'm going to come back to Emma's question first and then answer Mark's. Emma, I think that was a really brilliant question about kind of the language that we're using, and is decolonization the right framework to position some of the things that we're talking about today? I think I'm inclined to say yes, it is, but as I mentioned in my presentation, the cycle of decolonization as a theory is still quite in its development stages. So I'm open to kind of consider other kind of avenues and other aspects as well. And I think at this moment, as Afzal mentioned as well, it's really important to consider our histories, where we come from and where we are at this point. But I feel as decolonization, it has kind of come up quite a bit, and it's quite dominant, I think, in the university spaces. I'm not sure what it's like in the American universities, but especially at Edinburgh, at SOAS and elsewhere that I'm aware of, where I've got colleagues, decolonization is a term now. It's a buzzword. Everyone wants to be engaging in decolonization, and I really think it's in a static way. It's only decolonizing in processes at the university level. It's also about, well, let's reach out to communities, let's reach out to policy. What are the languages? And I think because the institution at this moment in time, the academy at this moment in time, has adopted this but adopted this language, we must work within the parameters of that language as well. So in a way, we're guided by the language set out by the academy, which as individuals, we cannot always kind of circumvent or kind of transpire from above that. So I think it's important for those reasons. But as well as that, I think it's important to look at race, but intersectionality. I think race and racism is really important as well, because they're current lived experiences, and a lot of our lectures, seminar today has been about lived experiences. But intersectionality is really important. And as Mark mentioned, he's read the auto-ethnographic paper. In that paper, I talk about how intersectionality doesn't really consider religion as an identity marker. And I think it's really important to consider the identity markers outside of the normal, the conventional intersectionality identity markers. Religion is one of them, and the ways in which, for example, as a Muslim woman, my religion might be, because I'm visibly Muslim and tan, visibly Sikh, our religion might form 80% of our discrimination in a certain situation, but it might be 20% gender, it might be 10% disability, and we need to think about the percentages of intersectionality markers in a discriminatory experience. So it's about rethinking and reframing the current language that we have, and I think that's the point that I'd like to make about decolonization and intersectionality, because we have them, and sometimes we're so absorbed into into applying them, and we can often kind of hitchhike on a term in academia and forget the meaning, and we need to remind ourselves of the current situation, the current occurrences and lived experiences that can better guide us in applying those terms and understanding those terms and practicing those terms effectively. So I think, yes, it's about language, but it's about adopting language in a reflexive way. So there's that to it. Coming back to Mark, I think as as someone of the margins, as you rightly mentioned, and I definitely see myself as that, as someone from the margins, it's difficult to navigate these different spaces. And coming back to Emma's point, I think language is really important, and trust is really important. The economy of trust, I think, is really important. Building trust with parliamentarians, and as someone who's experienced, who's lived, in a disadvantaged area, been born and raised there, as I mentioned, I was told by a careers advisor that I would never get into university. Having had those experiences, I really want to shorten the time span between research and policy change. And I think at this moment in time, as anthropologists, we do such amazing work, like amazing work. And anthropology, I've genuinely been, it's such a huge part of me. I really, as someone who's both an academic and who's come from these community, from a community where we need the anthropological work to make that policy change, to drive that social change, I think it's really important to diminish that gap between the research findings and the research, the effectual lived change. And so that's what the gap between that, the bridge between that, that's where this seminar today has really positioned itself. And language, as Emma mentioned, is really important to making that happen. But being someone from the margins and wearing these different hats isn't easy. But it's that lived experience, that positionality, and knowing that there's so many others like myself who desperately need that social change to come, inspires me to continue to kind of carry on and do this research. And I also did mention in my seminar that the Equality Act Review is completely unfunded. It's completely voluntary. And I think the current structures of the academy are quite oppressive, because the way decolonisation is currently practiced or not practiced, there's an argument for both actually, it actually places scholars like myself who wouldn't maybe think not so conventionally, further at the margins, because it's difficult for us to gain that exposure to convince people that our ideas actually can make a difference, and the work that we're doing is making a difference. But there's a lack of support, funding support. And actually, I speak from experience. I was shortlisted at SOAS for a UKRI £1.2 million Future Leaders Fellowship bid. And most of the reviewers came back and said, well, she doesn't have a monograph published yet. She doesn't have an ethnography published yet. And I just found the terminology so regressive, because I think, yes, it's great to have a monograph published, and I'm quite early as an early career researcher, but actually the publications that I have had, reports that I've had, have made probably a greater impact in policy than a journal publication probably would, which is sitting behind a paywall, and MPs and community members probably would never be able to, or very, very rarely be able to access. So we need to change the language that underpins and makes up the body of the structures, such as a UKRI, such as the boards of universities. And I think that is currently very limiting for scholars like myself from the margins. Afzal, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything, but I feel like you have to.
I've got to go, but I will make 2 points, actually, 2 quick points. And thank you, Richard, for chairing this event as well. So the first one was just carrying on from some of the issues and difficulties that you talked about. In the political circles within the Black, Asian, ethnic minority MPs, one of the MPs said something which I think in a way encapsulates some of those difficulties. And what they had said was that as a Black MP, you have to work twice as hard and half as wrong to come back down. I thought it was quite interesting encapsulating this. The second thing I wanted to say was, and it's something which I think feel quite strongly about, there's a huge debate, with this, the past and the history and the statues, lots of places, a lot of cities are doing reviews and looking at it. For me, fundamentally, the analogy I want to leave with you is this. If you have a car and you're sitting there as a driver, then we of course have a huge windscreen which tells you the way forward. And you also have a small mirror which helps you to understand the past. So it's sort of that sort of balance which I think personally I'm interested in. You know, we can't change the past, but the key important point with that is actually we understand it correctly. And that bias, the lenses which has been used, you know, they need to be cleaned up and put it in the right perspective. But more energy should be looked at today and looking ahead. And that, I think, will give us the best returns. Thank you again. I really enjoyed it. It's the first experience actually I have had this sort of encounter. And I do hope there'll be many more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Afzal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of questions coming in, and a lot of them sort of relate to some of the things you've talked about there. I'm going to skip ahead. I mean, we've got a question from Stuart, and we'll come back to that maybe. But do you mind if I skip ahead to Glaya, who had a question for Afzal Khan? And so I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Glaya. So the question is, what do you advise to a person such as I, who's aspiring to represent and advocate the indigenous or in the future at an international scale to give light to life of people who are experiencing marginality? What would your advice be? And I think, you know, as a wider question, you know, what Afzal just mentioned, this double load that you often have to carry, both as an academic, but also as an activist, as someone that represents yourself as an individual, but also is expected to represent your community. How can people be better allies for you in that?
I think this is a great question. Thank you so much. I think contacting MPs is really important, contacting policymakers, but it's not just, it's being very targeted in your approach in contacting parliamentarians. So there's 650 UK parliamentarians at the moment. Not all 650 MPs will be interested in the farmers' protest right now. Let's just be really honest here. And so it's about selecting who will most likely be able to pick up on your cause or feel sympathetic to the cause or want to raise this further. So I think it's really important to be targeted in the approach, select the MPs, contact the MPs. It might take a couple of goes to a couple of emails to really get a response from MPs. MPs offices, MPs don't always look at all of their emails, and they're not looking at their emails. It's a staffer or a researcher or someone from the office who will be monitoring and going through emails and then relaying what's come through in the inbox to the MPs. So I think that's really important to know and just be patient with that. I think, as I mentioned, and you know, a lot of why we're here today is, you know, raising the bar for anthropologists. I think, if I can say that, I don't know whether I can say that, but I think as anthropologists we should raise the bar for ourselves in terms of ethical anthropology, in terms of social justice. And really consider ourselves, as Tan mentioned, as Afzal mentioned, as an integral part of policymaking, because we've got access to these communities. And if we as anthropologists don't recognise the power that we have, then policymakers are being left with charities, think tanks, kind of journalists who are collecting the groundwork and influencing policymakers. And often these people, there's biases in their research, whereas as anthropologists, our grounding in our fieldwork is very robust, and our methodology is quite robust as well. So just having that belief that, you know, we need to be liaising with parliamentarians and policymakers is also really important. And I think it really comes to us to represent and put forward the narratives of marginality, especially that we come across in our interlocutors, wherever that might be around the world, in kind of fieldwork and communities, and putting those forward to the heart of governments, We may also be working in on issues in Europe, let's just say kind of Eastern Europe, and we may think, okay, well, today's seminar is about UK Parliament, or liaising with UK parliamentarians. How do I liaise with European Parliament? I think, or is it even worth liaising with or communicating with European Parliament? I think it's important to communicate with parliamentarians all over the world. Obviously start off with your own country, because even if you're based in the UK or in America or elsewhere, engage with your own parliamentarians, but there's nothing stopping you from engaging with parliamentarians across the globe. The more pressure that we can put in, like Tan said, from a UK perspective, we can put pressure on the Indian counterparts, more likely we can have the desired social outcome that we'd like. So thinking of it in a dynamic way, and again, moving away from this very static kind of concepts of decolonization or static concepts of what parliamentary engagement looks like. As I mentioned in my report, the seminar slides, there's many different ways of disseminating research. So the media, policy briefings that are 1 or 2 pages usually, but opinion posts are really important as well. So looking to publish an opinion post on a global media online platform, independent news, Guardian, they're always asking for pictures as well. And I think that's another really great way to disseminate research. And often what I've done is, if my research has been published in the Huffington Post, the Guardian, I'll copy and paste the link and I'll send that to the MP that I'm talking to, or the MP that I want to talk to, and I'll say, well, you can see an opinion post here about my research, and they're much like that. That provides more credibility, but also time is a really big issue. So how do we as anthropologists ensure that we provide research findings to MPs in a very consolidated way? And often reading an opinion post is very kind of easy to do for parliamentarians. That's another way that you can engage in that. I hope that's been helpful.
That's very helpful. I've certainly learned a lot today. But just moving on from communication and how to communicate research effectively for change. There's a question Stuart asks. Thanks you for your excellent presentation. And the question is this: that in terms of personal characteristics, PCs that you mentioned, there are other less biological characteristics, ascribed characteristics for consideration. What others are in the mix in your work with the Equalities Review, and how might they affect, including personal characteristics like homelessness, or indeed, I think, socioeconomic class, which, if I'm right, I do remember that the Equalities Act was originally, the bill was a Labour bill, wasn't it, under Gordon Brown, and I think that socioeconomic situation was included in that, but was taken out at some stage as it moved through Parliament. If you would like to sort of speak on those aspects of the Equalities Act.
I think that's a really, really good question. Thank you so much for raising that. I'm a bit mindful because we have a forthcoming report titled Equality Act 10 years on, which is hopefully going to be published sometime next month. So more details in that about what we'll be proposing and how to strengthen the Equality Act. At this moment in time, I think having had this remarkable and quite groundbreaking act for 10 years has been really useful. But again, it doesn't work in an intersectional way. So you can have race discrimination, let's just go with race discrimination, but judges will very rarely, or if ever, consider how race discrimination has interacted with gender discrimination. And often that, I mean, as we know from anthropology, you know, things don't occur statically. You're not going to be discriminated just because of your race. Your gender may have come, it may play a role in that. Black men in America, for instance, the high incarceration rate, that's gender and race, but courts will look at race discrimination alone. And I think that adds to the flawed nature of the Equality Act at this moment in time. So one thing that we'll be proposing is an intersectional practice through judges and through courts of the Equality Act, which is not currently done enough. And certainly in my case, it was not done. Yes, someone said dual discrimination. The second thing is we are lobbying the government to put in characteristics that extend beyond biology. So I think I was looking at the other day, 7 of the 9 protected characteristics at this moment in time relates to biology in some way, shape or form. So disability, pregnancy, race, ethnicity, it's something that you really can't change. It's like a birth, your birth lottery, right? And that's what the Equality Act currently covers and protects, but that's quite regressive in its way, because those things don't sit alone, as we too well know. Your race, your ethnicity, will and your gender will most likely be interacting with where you live, your postcode, for instance. So poverty, homelessness is something that we are lobbying to be put on to be a protected characteristic as well, and to encourage policymakers and legal practitioners to start thinking beyond equality as a body, like a static characteristic or static concept of equality based on the body alone and what you look like. It can also be what you experience. And I think that's where the Equality Act at this moment in time is falling short. Immigration is another great thing, a great point, aspect of this question. We are looking at incorporating immigration into the Equality Act. However, it's something that we're going to do in the second report, because putting that in now at this point, sometimes you have to make very calculated decisions when engaging with policymakers and policy in general, especially with the current government. Trying to ask for immigration on the first meeting or the first report, trying to ask for immigration to be protected as a characteristic under the Equality Act is, asking, for too much. Let's just be real here. And I think it's important to understand who you're dealing with, who you're communicating with. Understanding the current makeup of government is also important. And I think when times are a little bit more favorable, once we have a body of evidence and ideas that we put forward, i.e. the first report, the second report, we're hoping to kind of look at the ways in immigration can be incorporated into the Equality Act. But I think, one of the aims of the organization is to ensure that it's an iterative process. So we're always looking at improving the Equality Act, because time's always changing. I mean, society in the UK, the community in the UK has changed so much in the last 10 years. The Equality Act needs to be constantly reviewed every 10 years that we propose, to ensure that it's up to date, it's protecting the people of that time. And because things are changing so much and so often, it's really important that we regularly review it. And a decade, I think it's possible to review and keep reviewing the Equality Act every 10 years to make sure that it's catering for the needs.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, there's a lot has happened in the last decade, and in fact, a lot happened in the last 10 months that has raised issues around equality, and the muting of certain voices and social distance and marginality. A lot of questions coming in on the chat. Don't forget, if you want to ask a question in person, you can just raise your hand, and I'll ask you to unmute and ask directly to Suriyah. A question from James, who says, I think in general, people don't know what anthropology is, and I think that's absolutely true. How can we help to explain the basic theoretical ideas of the discipline to people, like positionality, auto-ethnography, participant observation? Given there are quite a lot of ideas within anthropological practice, sometimes it's hard to communicate them and the idea of the research. Does there need to be a project highlighting anthropology and its assets? Or can we integrate this into policy documents without overtly stating it as ethnographic or anthropological?
I think this is a great question, and I think it needs to be direct. It needs to be overt. It needs to be clear. We need more work to highlight the assets of anthropology, because we as anthropologists have those assets. And I think it needs to, talking about reverse engineering, we need to implement this and embed this within the teaching of anthropology. So the next generation of anthropologists have embedded within them these techniques and tools and the capacity to liaise with and engage with parliamentarians. I think whether that be through modules, through research methods trainings, I think somewhere along the line, we can look at this as a community of anthropologists here at the RAI, and I'm sure the RAI can host further events around this. But I definitely agree. I think there's a huge shortage. I've actually felt I have felt a bit of a lone voice in this, and to convince others that this is a vision worth getting involved in has been an uphill struggle at times, especially in the academy, and especially in social anthropology departments. I think can be much more, I think, equipped to dealing with this sort of engagement. I think right now it's lacking. I have to say it is lacking, but the skills are there already, and the assets of anthropology, we have those embedded within our discipline, and so we can, we're ready to go really. And it's just about, well, how do we formalize this? I just want to add, sorry, Richard, I think definitely this is a space that we can develop as a community, and that something definitely the RAI, I think, can, and should, rightly so, take a lead on.
Yeah, and it's absolutely something we're doing as part of the Policy and Practice Committee, to think about how we can create fora and platforms for these sorts of discussions to take place, for the rich information and detail and narratives that anthropologists can provide, but also to sort of bring that back even further to say, well, okay, not at the end process to provide detail, but actually to go back and question the assumptions, the framings that, as people devise policy as they go out, to actually integrate that at the beginning rather than as a sort of consideration at the end of these processes. So I look forward to working with you on that, Suriyah. As I say, it's something we're actively committed to. As I say, we've got questions coming in. I'm just scrolling down, and I'll go to each one. Okay, and where are we? So Stuart asks again a question on decolonizing and how it can be hijacked and seen as another word for changing the past. And I think that's one you've spoken about. It has become a buzzword. It has become a fuzzword, that we all use it, but there's some differences in what we actually mean by it. I'm just going down. Cornelia says, thanks for these great insights. As an anthropologist by training who works in the FCDO and is also a member of the Policy and Practice Committee, Cornelia, I'd like to see more anthropologists applying for the Whitehall Civil Service and or for those civil service placements and fellowships that exist. And it's certainly one of the ways we can shorten the journey between anthropological research and policy. So just a question for me. I mean, going back to something that Tan said about this difference between anthropology, which is seen as sort of rich detail about people, versus stats. Which of those, I mean, is it a balance between the two? How do they work? How do you use narrative effectively? And are we more than that? Are we more than just giving examples and narratives and motivating stories?
Great question. So in all of the research that you saw in my presentation slides, I used graphs as well, you might have noticed. So with the research projects that we have at the Equality Act Review, I employ a mixed methods approach. So we do have the numbers because, MPs do like to quote numbers. and it is a good and effective and powerful tool to have, to know how much of what is happening where, and have those percentages. That's really effective. However, it's the narratives that really do kind of, they're the icing on the cake, really, you know, drive home certain points. You know, I'm sure that's something that when I mentioned that women told me that their colleagues told them that they would burn their headscarves, that's probably something that you'll remember. That's something, that a narrative that won't really go away. And it's more powerful than when I said, probably, if I say 48.2% of women in the survey said that they experienced Islamophobia in the workplace, which of the two are you more likely to remember? And it is the narratives that I think most people will remember, really, because that's really moved them, and that's really thought, oh my God, that's quite, you know, severe. So while numbers can tell a story, it's up to a point. And I think it's the anthropologists, and as a discipline, anthropology, you know, we've got that ability to capture those narratives. And I think, yeah, we are more than just narratives. And I think this seminar has proven that we're more than just narratives. We're more than, you know, anthropologists go out and kind of look, you know, as I say, grandfather anthropology, you know, went into kind of communities, you know, Evans Pritchard, you know, for example, looking at communities and seeing their understandings. But it's important that we acknowledge those roots and how far anthropology has come from those early kind of practices of anthropology, and we are more than that. We are more than kind of collecting stories. It's about putting those stories into action as well. And you know, we talk about empowerment. We talk about having sorry, I've lost my words a bit, but that empowerment, to that agency, that's the word I was looking for. Sometimes a people or a community doesn't have that agency, but we can be that agency for them. And it's considering, I think there was a really good question from Mark earlier about, you know, these different roles that we have, and going into the field, we do have these different roles, and acknowledging those through reflexive anthropology, not only in relation to our interlocutors, but also in relation to outside of the academy. I think there needs to be a dynamic form of reflexive anthropology in play, not only reflexive with our interlocutors, understanding power imbalance, power relations with interlocutors within the fieldwork, but also the power that we have when engaging with policymakers, and the difference that we can make to and for the communities, and importantly with the communities that we're working with as anthropologists.
Do you see a difference in the sorts of conversations you have with parliamentarians versus policymakers who might be civil servants, and the sorts of evidence they require and the sorts of conversations you have?
I haven't actually liaised with many civil servants. I've liaised with parliamentarian staffers, so people who work in their offices. Very rarely, I think, civil servants have come to the fore. In my work, my line of work, I found civil servants to be very in the background, or to be based in Whitehall, and quite inaccessible. I wouldn't know how to access Parliament, a civil servant's email address, for example. They're not publicised very much, and I think there could be greater transparency and momentum from the civil service to work with academics, and in conjunction with academics and parliamentarians as well. And I think this sort of forum is an excellent space for civil servants, parliamentarians and academics to come together, because very rarely does that happen. So I think more of this should happen. And to answer your question, there is a difference, and the difference is that parliamentarians are. I can engage with parliamentarians more. Even when I was actually pre-coronavirus, used to go into parliament quite a lot, and I used to bump into MPs and parliamentary and their staff, but very rarely would I bump into a civil servant. And that's where a lot of networking used to happen, in Portcullis House, or in the corridors of Westminster when you're having lunch. So I think that's really important, is for civil servants to, and this is not a criticism of civil servants, but I think definitely there can be a much more kind of a publication of, not publication as in a format, publicized, but more outward kind of accessibility really with communities. And as someone in the sphere, I found it very difficult to find email addresses for civil servants, and I think that's a gap really.
Yeah, there's an interesting comparison between the roles of anthropologists and MPs, isn't there? Because both are sort of trying to move between different identities and different groups of constituents or interlocutors. Both are trying to communicate and translate information in the way they work. And it was interesting listening to Tan talk about the importance than a barrier. And some politicians maybe do that better than others. Stuart, you have in the chat mentioned the importance of psychology uptake and social geography, and I think your PhD was in the department of the geography department, wasn't it, Suriyah, at UCL, and politics, and it's been significant in recent years. I wonder if there's anything that can be learned from the narratives there. Perhaps if people liking to learn about their own experiences, and perhaps anthropology should use this as a hook to encourage more to go on to learn about others from there on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As someone whose PhD was at the Department of Geography at UCL, but then I did my final year at anthropology at Yale, I found that interdisciplinary kind of conversations really important. But I also found that can be limiting with anthropology is the different ways in which I should say, institutions consider or position themselves towards anthropology as a discipline. So UCL is very biological kind of based, I think, in my experience I found, or it kind of emphasizes evolutionary anthropology or animal behavior, or kind of the biological evolution, biological anthropology a little bit more. Oxford has a different kind of, I feel, kind of inclination around and practice of anthropology. Edinburgh a bit different. I think if there was a bit more unity with how institutions perceived anthropology, I think that would be a benefit. But if they also, even if they specialized in one branch of anthropology, to keep an open mind about other branches of anthropology is also really important. I actually didn't fit at my research project didn't fit at the anthropology department at UCL for the reasons I mentioned before. So I was a better fit at the human geography department there, and my PhD supervisors were human geographers, but my fieldwork and my methodology was anthropological. So, and I think that's saying something, and I think departments can get quite closed in at different institutions about the type of anthropology that they prefer, or that they, want to base their department culture around. It's really, really important to keep an open mind. I think, yeah. I think institutions need to kind of take that on board, I think.
Absolutely. There's some lovely comments in the chat. I don't know if you've had a chance to see them.
Sorry, you're breaking up, Richard.
Thanks for such an important... Sorry, yeah, I'm just saying some lovely comments in the chat. I'll read some out. Jill says, thanks for such an important and wide-ranging discussion. Gabriel says, you're an inspiration, Suriyah. Thank you. And Marcia says, thank you for such an incredibly important panel and RAI event. Can you also, we've got about 10 minutes left. I just wanted you to reflect a little bit about the importance of sort of the ethnography of the self which often we don't do. But I mean, I came to a talk you gave at SOAS a couple of years ago, and it was really interesting how you started on this journey, thinking about your own positionality, the way you were treated as well. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit on that subject.
Yeah, this is a great question. So for my PhD, I researched the experience of migrant men from South Asia, Pakistan, primarily Pakistan and Kashmir, in the city of Birmingham in the UK. And through my conceptualizations and kind of data analysis, or and fieldwork analysis, I actually found that I was both the South, the global South, as you like to, as I say in academia or in anthropology, the global South and the global North at the same time. Going back to Mark's point, which is so important about these different hats. And sometimes it's not about putting one hat down and picking up another one. All of them are in this space together, especially in my fieldwork and the write-up of my PhD. I don't view the global South and the global North as distinct geographies. I just don't perceive them in that way. And I think it's one strand to perceive it. To perceive them in that way is one solution and part of a bigger picture. What is probably better is to keep an open mind and consider that there can be the global South in the global North, and there can be global North in the global South. And as an anthropologist of the margins, as a woman of the margins, I actually embody the South in many ways. Being born and brought up in a largely disadvantaged area, high levels of poverty, council housing. At one point, I'm gonna be very honest with, there's 8 of us in my family. No, there's 10 of us, but I'm the oldest of 8 children. At one point, there were 5 of us, and we were in overcrowding housing in a 2-bedroom house. And so when we, as anthropologists, or consider this geography of the South, or the geography of inequality, we need to understand that, or we need to acknowledge that there's this geography of inequality and the geography of the South that is actually quite widespread in the North, in England as one of the world's developing leading economies. And so it's not as clear cut as, okay, the North is here and the South is there. And to conceptualize and organize and categorize our ethnography and anthropological thinking in that way, I think there needs to be a revision of that. And a couple of years ago, in 2018, the UN rapporteur, I think, for inequality, I might be, don't quote me on this, but someone from the UN came to the UK, toured the UK, 5 cities or something like that. There's a huge kind of news article about this, news media coverage around this at the time. And they said that the UK is actually resembles, the poverty in the UK resembles a developing country. So what happens then to our idea of the global South and the global North? The global South and the global North are not distinct areas. They can be, in and of each other. And there are areas in the global South that are very, are probably much more advanced than the city of Birmingham or Warsaw, where Mark comes from. Let's look at the Middle East. There are countries bordering one another that, there's high-rise, skyscrapers, and then there's, across the border, and you've got, a refugee camp, and where sanitation and water, isn't available. So we need to reconsider our conceptualization of the global South and the global North. As an individual, though, I felt that there was multiple times where I was both researching as a global. I was at the same time, I was someone of the global North researching the global South, and at the same time I was global South researching the global South, because of the way that the academy I was positioned within the academy, so I didn't get a scholarship. I wasn't receiving funding. I experienced discrimination in the workplace, which I lost my job for. I wasn't able to fund myself. And I genuinely felt that if my research was, for example, focusing on the way that migrant men from South Asia came into the UK and were being radicalized and into terrorism, I feel that my research would have had money chucked at me. But because I was researching the vulnerabilities of migrant men, there was no research, there was no funding available, or funding was not being allocated to me. And I think that is very telling of the structures of our institutions and the academy, particularly at UCL. And I've been very vocal about my criticisms of UCL and the structures towards BAME researchers, Black and minority researchers, for those of you might not be familiar with what BAME stands for, but also the allocation of funding for research projects. And I have a hypothesis. I think that if we did a study on the allocation of funds for PhD research, I believe that we will find an imbalance between funding that is allocated to researchers that kind of conduct research that confirms Western ideals, or not Western ideals, but the Western superiority over the East, or the global South, the global North, the global East. Kind of, I'm using those words, by the way, just to add inverted commas here, you know, because we have different conceptualizations of those terms as well, and there's lots of room for interpretation around them. So that's my personal experience. And so I think because of the way that my background, my experience, but also the way that I was positioned within the academy at the time, and sometimes continue to be positioned within the academy, it's not always easy, you know, as an early career researcher, precarious contracts, fixed term contracts. You know, I mentioned the responses that I got from reviewers for a lot of the work that, you know, I actually pitched the Equality Act Review as a format of using feminist ethnography to decolonize equality studies. That was my UKRI proposal, and the reviewers just said, you know, they scored it very low. And one of the things that said, she doesn't have publications. And I said, I do have publications in my PI response, but it's the fact that those publications are not valued in the same way as a publication in a journal. But for me, ethical academia, ethical anthropology is making sure that I've published research that is accessible to the communities that have engaged in that. And it's not behind a paywall. That format is not behind, does not involve publishing behind in a journal that is behind that has a paywall. So that's really important. So just to summarize, I think, you know, my main point here is that there's the global South and the global North they're not two distinct, you know, areas. It's in and of the other, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we could do another whole seminar, couldn't we, on this question of how research is framed, who determines how research is funded, what sort of assumptions they take into that, and who benefits from that. We've run out of time, though. Unfortunately, this is going to be an ongoing conversation, and one we will keep asking these questions because they're such important questions to ask. Suriyah, can you pass our thanks on to Afzal and to Tan for joining us, and also can I just also thank Amanda and Haneen at the RAI for their brilliant technical support. I just have a couple of announcements. The next in the series of Anthropology Communicates seminars is Sue Black talking about anthropology. So Professor Sue Black talking about anthropology and forensic anthropology. And that's on the 11th of March between 3 and 5. And we also have Esri, who was also sits on the Policy and Practice Committee, is running an event on the 22nd of February between 3 and 5 on anthropology of and of the future, anthropology and stroke of the future, which promises to be really interesting, and I'm certainly looking for webpage to get a link. Suriyah, finally, thank you ever so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been lovely talking to you this week, and I look forward to working with you on the Policy and Practice committee going forward. Can we all just unmute ourselves, and we can then give Suriyah a clap? It's so odd on Zoom, we don't have a proper way to finish these sessions. So on the count of 3, if we could all give a round of applause to Suriyah. 1, 2, 3. Everyone, thank you, Suriyah.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.